What has always struck me is how some of the most disturbing things can happen in places specifically designed to make people feel completely safe. November 13th, 2015. Rowlett, Texas, an affluent suburb of Dallas. The upscale Spinnaker Cove neighborhood sits right along the shore of the massive Lake Ray Hubbard. Perfect green lawns, expensive cars, security cameras, and the kind of place where almost nothing seems out of the ordinary. It's getting close to noon, about 11:50 a.m. A 19-year-old named Brian comes downstairs from the second floor and heads into the kitchen to make his morning coffee. Brian lives in a world without sound. He has been completely deaf since birth and has also been diagnosed with autism. There was simply no way for him to hear anything that had happened inside the house several hours earlier. Brian walks into the kitchen and suddenly stops. A woman is lying face down on the tile floor in a large pool of blood. She's wearing ordinary jeans and a hooded sweatshirt. A single spent shell casing is lying nearby. A severe injury to her head has left her face completely unrecognizable. Given the way Brian processes what he sees, combined with the shock of that moment, he comes to a conclusion that seems strange at first, but makes sense from his perspective. He believes the woman is the mother of his older sister's fiancé, who had arrived in town from Greece the day before for the upcoming wedding. Brian doesn't have a cell phone with him, and there's no landline in the house. Panicked, he runs outside and rushes to the nearest neighbors. They immediately contact emergency services, while also calling the fiancé to tell him what Brian has found. And that's when the first thing stops making sense. The fiancé's mother is alive, perfectly fine, and standing right there with her son. So if that isn't her on the kitchen floor, who is it? Within minutes, the first patrol officers arrive. They secure the kitchen, carefully turn the woman over, and immediately realize who they're looking at. Lying on the cold tile is 37-year-old Laura Ann Grillo, Brian's older sister, and the woman who owns the house. One of her shoes has come off and is lying several feet away, while her keys and purse are still trapped underneath her body. Laura was supposed to get married in exactly 8 days. If we put the emotions aside for a moment and look strictly at what investigators documented at the scene, the picture is strange. At first glance, it looks like a burglary that somehow went wrong. The upstairs bedroom has been completely torn apart. Documents are scattered across the bed, and empty jewelry boxes are lying on the floor. Someone clearly spent time going through the valuables and deciding what to take. There's also a small safe inside the room. Laura had been keeping $9,000 in cash there, money she had set aside for her honeymoon. The safe is completely empty. At first, the pieces seem to fit. Someone gets into the house, finds the money, runs into the homeowner after she returns, and gets rid of the witness. But we all know real investigations rarely come together that neatly. I always pay attention to the details that don't fit, and in this case, they're impossible to ignore. Let's look carefully at what investigators actually found. The windows are intact. None of the doors have been forced open. There are absolutely no signs that anyone tampered with the locks. The front door is simply unlocked. And here's the most interesting part. The safe wasn't cut open or forced. Whoever opened it entered the correct electronic code. That means the person responsible for what happened to Laura had access to the house, managed to get inside without triggering the security system, and knew the exact combination to the safe where the cash was kept. And this is where one detail makes the entire case even more unusual. The officers who arrived at the scene weren't shocked only by what had happened. Laura Ann Grillo was one of their own. She officially volunteered with the local police academy and served as a volunteer patrol officer, regularly going out into this very neighborhood to help keep her neighbors safe. So who needed to get inside the locked home of someone connected to local law enforcement without forcing their way in, calmly open a safe using the correct code, take the money, and then commit a crime against Laura in her own kitchen? To understand who could walk into that house without raising suspicion and enter the safe combination without making a mistake, I had to take a closer look at the people who had access. How many random burglars do you know who can somehow punch the right combination into someone else's safe while supposedly acting in a panic? Investigators weren't buying that kind of coincidence either. Behind the comfortable image of this Texas home was a fairly complicated family situation, and that was where the first answers were likely to be found. Let's start with Laura herself. She was raising 3 daughters. Her 2 older daughters were from previous relationships, while the youngest, Maria, was Laura's daughter with the man she was about to marry. You already know about Brian, the 19-year-old who found Laura. But there was a very specific, practical reason he was living under the same roof as his sister, something only the people closest to her knew about. Laura was deeply afraid of one of her former partners. She absolutely refused to stay in the house without someone there with her. Despite Brian being deaf and autistic, having her brother around gave Laura a sense of security. She genuinely believed that with another person in the house, her former partner wouldn't dare physically harm her. Now we need to look at the man who was supposed to become her husband. Ioannis Makris, known to everyone as John. He was 38 years old, originally from Greece, a former member of the military, and by the time the wedding was approaching, he owned his own property renovation and remodeling company. From the outside, Laura and John looked like the classic picture of a successful couple building their American dream together in a beautiful home by the lake. But once investigators started looking at what was really going on inside this family, that picture-perfect image fell apart almost immediately. They learned that John was extremely controlling. His jealousy seemed to have no limits and regularly crossed into the absurd. At one point, he even made Laura go through the humiliating process of taking an official DNA test to prove that he was the biological father of their young daughter, Maria. Living under that kind of pressure day after day gradually turned Laura's comfortable life into a very expensive cage. By June 2015, 5 months before what happened in the kitchen, the tension between them had reached its breaking point. Laura finally decided she was done. She sat down at her computer and wrote John a detailed email telling him directly that she was leaving him. While going through the case records, one detail in that message really stood out to me. Laura was clearly trying to avoid a major confrontation and any possible aggression from John, so she voluntarily gave up any financial claims against him. She explicitly promised that she would not seek child support for their daughter. Think about the logic behind that for a moment. Laura was so intimidated that she was essentially trying to buy her way out of the relationship, giving up money she was legally entitled to in exchange for her freedom and some basic peace of mind. So how did a man with such a strong need for control respond? For John, losing control of the situation and of Laura herself was simply unacceptable. Instead of packing his things, moving out, or sitting down with her to work through the separation like adults, he made a completely unexpected move. Just 1 month after Laura sent that breakup email, in July 2015, John bought a ring and officially proposed to her. Laura, exhausted by the constant emotional back and forth, and apparently willing to believe there was still one last chance to build a normal family for Maria's sake, said yes. Their relationship suddenly had a completely different status. The wedding was officially scheduled for November. That was when the couple began setting aside cash for their honeymoon. The same $9,000 that would later become so important to the investigation was carefully placed inside the safe on the second floor. Wedding preparations moved ahead at full speed. Invitations went out. Laura continued patrolling the streets of her neighborhood, helping protect the people who lived around her, while none of those neighbors had any idea what kind of psychological pressure was actually playing out behind the closed doors of her own home. Any criminal investigation begins by taking a close look at the people nearest to the victim, and detectives immediately had two obvious individuals to examine. The first was the former partner Laura had been so afraid of. Police quickly contacted people around him, checked his cell phone location data, and reviewed travel records. It turned out he had been in a completely different state at the time. His alibi was airtight and backed up by documentation. That lead disappeared almost as quickly as it had emerged. The second obvious person to look at was the grieving fiancé. Detectives questioned John right there at the scene, but almost immediately ran into a wall of evidence, suggesting he couldn't have been directly involved. On the morning of November 13th, John had driven to a Home Depot in Dallas, and he wasn't alone. His mother, the same woman who had just arrived from Greece, was with him. Store surveillance cameras clearly captured both of them walking through the aisles at the exact time the incident was taking place back in Laura's kitchen. The receipts matched the timeline down to the minute. Their route was confirmed by GPS data. John also appeared completely cooperative. He voluntarily agreed to have his hands tested for gunshot residue. Forensic technicians performed the test, and the result came back negative. From a legal standpoint, there was nothing physically connecting him to what happened inside that house. It looked like investigators had reached a perfectly constructed dead end. Not a single piece of physical evidence pointed where they needed it to. But what always gets my attention in cases like this isn't how someone behaves when they know cameras are watching. It's what they do when they think no one important is paying attention. Most people who lose the person they were supposed to marry just 1 week before the wedding would be completely overwhelmed. John, however, showed a level of cold practicality that made people around him deeply uncomfortable. The wedding vendors refused to refund the money he had already paid for the floral arrangements. John wasn't willing to accept that loss, so instead of letting the money go, he simply instructed the florists to turn Laura's wedding flowers into funeral arrangements. And it didn't stop there. When neighbors offered to help the family clean the dried blood from the kitchen tile, John made a comment that left them stunned. With a smirk, he suggested they use Laura's toothbrush to scrub the floor, adding that she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Then detectives asked the obvious question: how could an unknown person have entered the house without forcing a door or window? Without hesitation, John tried to shift the blame onto Laura's 19-year-old autistic brother. According to him, Brian had probably just forgotten to lock the front door. After seeing this kind of behavior, detectives decided to dig deeper. They requested John's complete phone records, even though he appeared to have an airtight alibi. And buried among the routine business calls was one contact that immediately stood out. At 7:45 that morning, roughly half an hour before the crime, John called one of the employees at his remodeling company. The conversation lasted exactly 1 minute. The employee's name was Jesus Trevino. Police ran his name through federal databases and discovered a disturbing detail. Trevino was listed on the official sex offender registry. That raised an obvious question. How could a man who obsessively controlled his fiancée's every move and even demanded a DNA test to confirm that Maria was biologically perfectly comfortable, allowing a registered offender anywhere near his home and daughters. But investigators found the most important clue in their text messages. Immediately after that brief phone call, John sent Jesus Trevino a message. "Great day to get some work done." At almost exactly that time, Laura was pulling out of the garage to take her youngest daughter to school, leaving the house empty. The message had been sent. The house was empty. Now detectives had a specific goal: prove that John's employee had been in the Spinnaker Cove area that morning instead of working at another job site. And this is where technology came into play, because phone data doesn't care what story someone tells investigators. These days, a person doesn't even have to leave fingerprints behind. We voluntarily carry incredibly accurate digital tracking devices in our pockets. Cell phone data expert Michael Fegley was brought in to analyze Trevino's movements. Using ZETX geospatial software, he reconstructed Jesus Trevino's route minute by minute. The results left very little room for explanation. Cell tower records showed that around the time of the incident, Trevino's phone was connecting to towers near Laura's home. But investigators still had another problem. How do you connect the person who allegedly carried out the plan to the person who arranged it, when John had already tested negative for gunshot residue? Police went back to the surveillance footage from the Home Depot parking lot and reviewed that morning frame by frame. At 9:43 a.m., Jesus approached John in the parking lot. The two men greeted each other, and John casually hugged his employee. That brief contact would become a major problem for him. Forensic science works on a basic principle of transfer. Whenever two people or objects come into contact, physical material can move between them. During that hug, microscopic particles of lead, barium, and antimony, the same invisible residue that had settled on Trevino's clothing after the weapon was used, transferred onto John's jacket. A more detailed laboratory examination of the fabric seriously undermined his seemingly perfect alibi. Science had now connected the alleged organizer and the person investigators believed had carried out the plan through a microscopic chemical trail. On November 19th, detectives obtained a warrant and began monitoring John's phone calls. The intercepted conversations made one thing clear: Trevino was panicking. He understood that investigators were getting closer. Unable to handle the pressure, he fled and disappeared from the state. To locate him, the technical team gained access to his personal Google Drive account. What investigators found there was about as close to a jackpot as they could have hoped for. Jesus had been keeping records. He used a mobile app that automatically recorded every phone call he made or received. Gigabytes of audio files had been stored in his cloud account, including detailed conversations about the plan targeting Laura. Which raises an obvious question. Why would someone involved in a paid criminal scheme keep evidence that could directly implicate him and potentially put him behind bars for the rest of his life? The answer came down to greed and fear. Trevino had been saving those recordings as his own version of mutually assured destruction. They were insurance in case his boss ever decided that an unnecessary witness had become a liability. At the same time, the files could eventually be used as leverage for blackmail. The criminal logic was simple. If I go down, you're going down with me. You know what makes this story especially ironic? The hidden call recording app Trevino used had been installed at John's direct instruction. As the owner of the company, John required his employees to record their phone conversations with customers so he could monitor their work. In the end, his own company policy became one of the most important pieces of evidence showing how the crime had been planned. Those recordings recovered from the cloud finally gave investigators a complete picture of the preparation behind what happened to Laura. And it turned out that the story about someone stealing the honeymoon money from the safe had been nothing more than a carefully staged setup. Movies have conditioned us to imagine suitcases filled with millions when someone is paid to carry out a crime. In reality, the numbers in this case were disturbingly ordinary. The $9,000 hadn't been stolen at all. John had personally entered the electronic code, removed the cash from the safe, and handed it to Trevino as an advance payment. Laura Ann Grillo's life had been valued at exactly $15,000, and the most disturbing part was that most of the money used to pay for the plan had come from Laura's own savings. In the weeks leading up to November 13th, the group had tried to carry out the plan 3 separate times. Each attempt was disrupted by something completely ordinary. One time, watchful neighbors came outside to water their lawn. Another time, a utility vehicle happened to drive past. As the delays continued, John became increasingly frustrated. Time was running out. The wedding date was getting closer, and he had no intention of canceling it and explaining everything to their relatives. John even brought a hired driver into the plan, a man named James Villada, whose job was to drive Trevino away afterward. The remodeling company owner personally drove James through the streets of his upscale neighborhood, carefully pointing out the blind spots in the security camera coverage and showing him the best routes for leaving the area. The digital evidence allows us to reconstruct the morning of November 13th, almost minute by minute. The window for carrying out the plan was extremely narrow, between 8:10 and 8:22 a.m. Laura got into her car and drove her youngest daughter to school. The house was left empty. Trevino calmly opened the front door, using keys John had arranged for him in advance. He disabled the security system with the code he had been given, walked into the kitchen, and waited. Laura returned home, stepped inside, and suddenly found an armed stranger standing in front of her. Her survival instinct kicked in immediately. She realized she needed to get out and quickly turned toward the door. But she was wearing only smooth socks. Laura slipped badly on the polished kitchen tile and lost her balance. At that moment, Trevino moved toward her and fired a single shot from a .40 caliber handgun, causing a fatal injury to her head. After completing the job, Trevino rushes outside, jumps into the waiting car with Villada, and the two speed away from the neighborhood. To avoid attracting attention from passing drivers with a visible weapon, Trevino decides to take the handgun apart right there in the passenger seat. He puts his hands and the weapon inside his heavy backpack and begins disassembling it. Pay attention to that detail, because this is where basic forensic science comes into play. There's a fundamental rule known as Locard's exchange principle. In simple terms, whenever two objects come into physical contact, they leave traces on each other. By taking apart a firearm inside a confined fabric bag, Trevino made a critical and surprisingly amateur mistake. The enclosed space trapped microscopic gunshot residue, biological material connected to Laura, and traces from Trevino himself. The fabric of that ordinary backpack held onto all of it. Without realizing it, he had turned an everyday item into a container, preserving evidence that could eventually connect the people involved to the crime. That evidence finally became crucial in the spring of 2016, when police began closing in on everyone connected to the plan. Investigators tracked down James Villada. During a search of his inexpensive motel room, they looked underneath the bed and found that same backpack. Laboratory testing confirmed the chemical and biological material embedded in the fabric. Faced with physical evidence he couldn't explain away, Vileta immediately understood how serious his situation was and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Not long afterward, investigators also located and arrested Trevino, who had fled the state. Now detectives had direct testimony, and they were ready to go after the man they believed had designed the entire plan. John's interrogation was assigned to experienced Texas Ranger Jim Holland. Holland put intense psychological pressure on him. He placed the prepared charging documents on the table and presented John with a straightforward choice: cooperate and potentially spend the rest of his life in a relatively less restrictive prison setting, or risk facing the most severe punishment available under Texas law. I've spent years studying criminal behavior, and the way people react when they realize they have almost no options left never stops being revealing. John remained completely silent. He admitted nothing. And after walking out of the interrogation room, he calmly continued giving interviews to the local media, presenting himself as a grieving fiancé whose life had been shattered. The court proceedings stretched on for several years and didn't conclude until 2019. The evidence was more than enough for the jury to reach a clear verdict. Jesus Trevino and John Macrease were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. James Vileta, after cooperating with investigators and providing information about the plan, received a 25-year prison sentence. At that point, you might think the people responsible were behind bars and the case was finally over. But the justice system can sometimes operate according to rules that leave little room for the human consequences that follow. Under state law, Laura's two older daughters were placed in the custody of their biological father. The concerns Laura had expressed about that man were not enough to change what the system ultimately decided. Brian suddenly lost the sister who had also been the person providing stability in his everyday life. He was left without the support structure he had depended on, and the assistance available to him was not enough to keep his life together. Eventually, Brian lost his housing and ended up living on the streets with virtually nothing. But there's one detail in the final chapter of this case that I still find almost impossible to understand. Even from a maximum security prison, the man who arranged the crime tried to strike one more time. John filed a civil lawsuit seeking parental rights to his youngest daughter, Maria. And the obvious question is, why would a man serving a life sentence fight for custody of his daughter? It was a direct attempt to financially drain Laura's best friend, Heather, who had taken Maria into her home. Heather was forced to launch an online fundraiser just to cover the endless bills from expensive attorneys. She endured the legal pressure, successfully fought John's lawsuits, and eventually became Maria's legal adoptive mother, finally bringing this painful case to a real legal conclusion.